Did you know that not all crusades were fought between Christians and Muslims? The popular image of the Crusades is often one of clashing faiths, but the reality is far more complex and surprising than most people realize. The Fourth Crusade, for example, saw Christian knights turn their swords not against Muslims, but against fellow Christians, as they shockingly sacked Constantinople, the largest and most magnificent Christian city in the world at the time. This devastating event shattered the once mighty Byzantine Empire, leaving its treasures plundered and its people betrayed. It exposed the true motives that often lay beneath the surface of these so-called holy wars: ambition, greed, and ruthless political intrigue. The Crusaders, who were supposed to fight for God and the Church, ended up fighting for gold, power, and personal gain. In their quest, they even turned on their fellow Christians, betraying the very ideals they claimed to defend. Originally, the Crusaders set out for Egypt, aiming to strike at Muslim power, but mounting debts to Venetian merchants and the tempting promises of a Byzantine prince lured them off course, changing the fate of the entire expedition. Their spiritual mission, once filled with hope and purpose, was quickly corrupted by worldly concerns. The events of the Fourth Crusade forever changed the meaning and legacy of crusading in Europe. The sack of Constantinople forces us to question the real goals behind these so-called holy wars, and to reconsider what we think we know about the past. History is rarely a simple story of good versus evil. The Crusades were shaped by human flaws, ambitions, and desires, making them far more complicated than legends suggest. To truly understand this era, we must look beyond the battlefield and into the hearts and minds of those who lived it, seeking the deeper truths hidden within their stories. The Crusades were a series of religious wars that spanned from the 11th to the 13th centuries, shaping the course of European and Middle Eastern history in profound ways. These campaigns were initiated by the Latin Church, which called upon Christians to take up arms in the name of faith. While the Crusades are most famously remembered for the battles fought in the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule, their scope was much broader. The term crusade also came to describe military campaigns against pagans in the Baltic, heretics in Europe, and even political rivals of the papacy. Crusaders took solemn vows, wore the iconic cross on their clothing, and were promised forgiveness of sins, a powerful motivator in a deeply religious age where salvation was a central concern. These were massive undertakings, drawing in not just kings and knights, but also peasants, merchants, and clergy. Each participant had their own reasons. Some sought spiritual reward, others adventure, land, wealth, or simply an escape from hardship at home. The Crusades were not a single unbroken conflict, but rather a series of distinct campaigns, each shaped by its own leaders, goals, and historical circumstances. Historians typically numbered the major crusades to the Holy Land from 1 to 9, but there were many other related expeditions and offshoots, some lasting only months, others spanning decades. Each crusade was a response to the unique political, social, and religious climate of its time, reflecting the shifting alliances and rivalries of medieval Europe and the wider world. To truly understand the Crusades, we must see each as a separate chapter in a much larger, complicated story, one that spans continents and centuries. Ultimately, the Crusades were as much about power, politics, and the ambitions of rulers as they were about faith and religious devotion, leaving a legacy that still echoes today. The First Crusade began with a desperate plea from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, whose empire was reeling from the relentless advance of the Seljuk Turks. Anatolia, once the heartland of Byzantine power, had been overrun, and the emperor's armies were stretched thin, unable to halt the invaders alone. Facing the real possibility of losing his empire, Alexios turned to the west for aid, hoping to find allies among fellow Christians. Alexios sent envoys to Pope Urban II, requesting a small but skilled force of mercenary knights to reinforce his beleaguered troops. He envisioned a limited military alliance, just enough to push back the Turks and restore stability to his lands. But Pope Urban saw a far greater opportunity. He recognized the chance to unite the often warring kingdoms of Europe under a single cause, strengthening his own authority and the influence of the Church. Instead of sending a handful of mercenaries, he called for a holy war to liberate Jerusalem and the Christian East. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban delivered a rousing speech. He spoke of the suffering of Eastern Christians, the desecration of holy sites, and the spiritual rewards awaiting those who took up the cross. His words electrified the crowd, igniting a fervor that spread rapidly across Europe. The Pope's speech transformed a political request into a spiritual quest. He appealed not only to religious devotion but also to the promise of adventure, honor, and even the lure of wealth and land in distant lands. The response was overwhelming. Cries of Deus vult or God wills it echoed through towns and villages, as people from all walks of life pledged themselves to the cause. What began as a simple call for mercenaries quickly became a mass movement. Knights, nobles, peasants, and even entire families prepared to journey east, united by faith and hope for a better future. The First Crusade was set in motion, far surpassing the emperor's expectations. Waves of crusaders began their long and perilous journey toward the Holy Land, forever altering the course of history. The stage was set for a dramatic collision of faith, ambition, and unforeseen consequences that would echo for centuries. The Crusades would never be the same, and neither would the world they left behind. Religious zeal was powerful, but the promise of land and wealth was just as enticing for many crusaders. In Europe, younger sons had little hope of inheritance, so the Crusades offered a chance to carve out new kingdoms in the East. The Middle East was seen as a land of riches. Cities like Antioch and Jerusalem were hubs of trade and luxury. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa turned the Crusades into commercial ventures, profiting from transport and trade concessions. Even peasants saw the Crusades as an escape from poverty and oppression, hoping for a better life abroad. For many, the journey east was less a sacrifice and more a desperate gamble for a new beginning. The Holy War became a magnet for ambition, greed, and dreams of fortune. Economic motives shaped every stage of the Crusades, from the highest nobles to the poorest serfs. The Crusades were as much about opportunity as they were about faith. Pope Urban II's call for crusade was a masterstroke of strategy, boosting the papacy's power during a fierce struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor. By launching a military campaign under his authority, the Pope positioned himself as the true leader of Christendom. The crusade also exported Europe's violence, redirecting warring knights toward a common enemy and bringing a measure of peace at home. Urban hoped to heal the rift between the Western and Eastern churches by aiding Byzantium, aiming for papal supremacy. Though reunification failed, the papacy became the center of European politics for centuries, calling crusades, raising taxes, and wielding immense influence. The Pope became a spiritual monarch with real political power. The Crusades were as much about papal ambition as religious devotion. Urban's vision changed the course of European history. When the Crusaders arrived, the Muslim world was divided. Rival dynasties like the Seljuks and Fatimids competed for power. This disunity allowed the First Crusade to succeed where later ones would fail. Many Muslim leaders underestimated the Crusaders, mistaking them for another wave of Byzantine mercenaries. The brutality of the Crusaders, especially at Jerusalem, shocked the region and left a deep scar in Muslim memory. Over time, leaders like Zangi, Nur al-Din, and Saladin united Muslim factions, framing the conflict as a religious duty, jihad, to reclaim lost lands. The Crusader states forced Muslims to adapt, leading to new calls for unity and resistance. The Muslim response evolved from confusion to determined opposition. The Crusades became a catalyst for political and religious change in the Middle East. The legacy of violence and resistance would echo for centuries. The Crusades were a turning point for both worlds. The First Crusade began with chaos. The People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, was a disaster, ending in massacre and defeat. The real force, the Prince's Crusade, was led by powerful nobles but plagued by rivalry and lack of unity. Their journey was brutal victory at Dorylaeum, a grueling siege at Antioch, and near starvation. Against all odds, they captured Antioch, then pressed on to Jerusalem, their numbers decimated. After a 5-week siege, they took the city in 1099, unleashing a massacre that shocked even their contemporaries. The Crusaders established 4 states along the Mediterranean, but their success was built on hardship and violence. The First Crusade was a story of faith, ambition, and ferocity. The dream of a Christian Jerusalem was achieved, but at a terrible cost. The legacy of bloodshed would haunt the region for generations. The Crusades were born in chaos and ended in conquest. After the First Crusade, religious zeal faded and the movement's purpose shifted. The Second Crusade failed due to poor planning and infighting, damaging the crusading ideal. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, won battles but failed to retake Jerusalem, settling for a truce with Saladin. The Fourth Crusade, hijacked by Venetian interests, ended with the sack of Constantinople, Christians fighting Christians. Later crusades lost focus, failed invasions, diplomatic deals, and shrinking crusader states. By the late 13th century, the dream of a Christian-controlled Jerusalem was over. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The Crusades became a story of shifting priorities and lost ideals. What began as a holy mission ended in political cynicism and decline. The Crusades ended centuries ago, but their legacy still shapes our world. They created a long history of conflict between Christian West and Islamic East, fueling myths and modern tensions. Economically, the Crusades spurred growth. Italian city-states grew rich, and Europe was introduced to new goods and ideas from the Middle East. The returning Crusaders brought back foods, fabrics, and scientific knowledge, helping to spark the Renaissance. Politically, kings and popes gained power, while many nobles lost land or lives, allowing for stronger, centralized states. In the Middle East, the Crusades prompted Muslim unity and the rise of new dynasties. Yet, amid the violence, there were zones of cultural exchange, Christians, Muslims, and Jews living, trading, and influencing each other. The Crusades were not just war, but a tangled story of faith, greed, and surprising connections. To understand our world, we must keep exploring these complex stories from our past.